You weren't supposed to stand out. That's what they said about her. Just another face in the chapel. Another quiet girl humming to herself. No one ever guessed that behind that calm smile and soft tune was a name that once echoed through battlefield comms. Sergeant Clara Starr. If you still believe that some heroes never stop serving, even when the world stops watching, like and subscribe, because this story proves that humility can carry more honor than any medal ever could. It started on a Sunday morning, the kind that smelled faintly of rain and candle wax. The old base chapel at Fort Laramie was nearly empty, sunlight pushing through stained glass, casting fractured colors across wooden pews. The few who came that early were the same faces, the chaplain arranging hymn sheets, a pair of retirees in faded uniforms, and the young woman who always sat 3 pews from the front, her head bowed, her voice low. She was maybe 28, soft-spoken, never late. She worked maintenance in the admin building, most thought. Or maybe she helped in logistics. No one really knew. No one ever asked. She didn't wear medals or badges, just a plain gray sweater and jeans that still held the crispness of order, like someone who folded everything with military precision but no longer had a reason to wear the uniform. That morning, she hummed again. Not the whole song, just a piece of it, a tune that sounded half like a prayer and half like a memory. Her hands rested gently on the wooden pew, fingertips tracing the grain like she was reading the story written there. Behind her, 2 recruits whispered, trying to keep their voices low. She's here every week. Yeah, weird, right? She's too young to be a widow. The older man in the back, Sergeant Hendricks, shot them a look that silenced both. He'd been around long enough to recognize the sound of loss when he heard it. The chapel clock ticked softly. The chaplain adjusted his glasses, preparing his notes, glancing toward the young woman who never missed a Sunday. He'd asked her name once. Clara, she'd said simply. Just Clara. When he'd asked if she'd like to join the choir, she'd smiled faintly and said, "No, sir. I just hum." It had sounded strange then. Humble, almost shy, but something in the way she said it carried a weight no one could quite place. That morning, her humming grew softer, then faded. She looked toward the altar, toward the folded flag that had been set there last month for Memorial Week. She stared at it for a long time, her lips parting just slightly, whispering something no one heard. And for a moment, the light from the stained glass fell directly across her face, illuminating her eyes, steady, distant, like someone who'd already seen everything worth seeing and somehow survived it. Outside, the wind shifted. A faint static crackled through the base's old radio intercom, a relic that hung crooked on the chapel wall, more decoration than device. No one paid it any mind at first. Then it hissed again, louder this time. A faint male voice tried to push through the distortion. The chaplain frowned, tapping the side of the unit. It wasn't even supposed to be on during service hours. The retirees glanced at one another. Then the voice broke through clearly, echoing through the chapel with a tone so sharp and official it froze everyone where they stood. "Attention, all personnel. Sergeant Clara Starr, report to Honor Guard Command immediately. Repeat, Sergeant Clara Starr, report to Honor Guard Command." The words hung in the air like thunder that didn't fade. The recruits in the back looked around, confused. "Sergeant?" The chaplain blinked, stunned. "Starr?" For a moment, it was as if time had stopped between one heartbeat and the next. All eyes turned toward the young woman in the gray sweater, still sitting, still calm, still holding the same quiet posture as if nothing had changed. But everything had. She rose slowly. No rush, no panic. She didn't explain, didn't excuse. She simply smoothed her sweater, adjusted her sleeve, and reached for the small silver locket she wore on a chain under her collar. She pressed it once, gently, then looked toward the chaplain. He didn't speak, just stared, mouth open, the name echoing in his mind. "Sergeant Starr." The recruits straightened instinctively, the way muscle memory does when authority enters the room. "I have to go," she said softly. Her voice was calm, level, but there was something beneath it, something steady and final, like a tone soldiers use before walking into something sacred. "Clara," the chaplain began, unsure. "You here?" She gave a faint smile, the kind that asked not to be questioned. "It's been a long time, sir," she said. "But when they call, you answer." She turned toward the door, her steps unhurried, her composure unshaken. The recruits whispered again, this time not with curiosity, but with disbelief. Honor Guard. Is she? She's too young for that. You need service medals for Honor Guard. The chaplain stood rooted in place, eyes following her until she disappeared through the wooden doors into the sunlight. For a moment, the chapel was utterly silent. No humming, no wind, no ticking clock, just stunned stillness. Outside, the sound of engines rolled across the courtyard. Two black SUVs pulling to the curb. The doors opened in perfect sync. Uniformed officers stepped out, crisp, immaculate, bearing the unmistakable gravity of ceremony. They didn't look around. They looked for her. One of them saluted before she even reached the steps. She returned it without hesitation. Inside, the recruits stumbled to the windows, watching. "What the hell?" one whispered. The older man, Hendricks, leaned forward in his seat. His eyes narrowed, his throat tightening. "I know that name," he murmured. "Sergeant Starr, Afghanistan, 2016. The medic who..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The chaplain stepped to the window just as Clara climbed into the SUV. For a second, she glanced back toward the chapel, toward the flag still draped across the altar. Her hand rose, not in salute, but in quiet farewell, the kind that spoke to something unseen. Then the car door shut, and she was gone. No one moved for a long time. The recruits sat back down, the color drained from their faces. The chaplain turned slowly toward the empty pew she'd left behind, where sunlight still fell in the same spot, warm and golden. On the wood, faintly scratched into the surface, were two words someone had once carved with the edge of a dog tag: "Be steady." And for the first time that morning, the chapel felt like hallowed ground again. Not because of the hymns, or the sermon, or even the stained glass, but because someone who had carried both war and peace inside her heart had just walked out of it. Quietly, humbly, exactly as heroes do. They said she was just a woman who hummed to herself, lost in memory. They were wrong. She wasn't remembering. She was standing watch, one last time. The chapel doors hadn't even finished closing before the whispers began. No one knew what to say, or what they had just seen. The chaplain stood frozen near the altar, his sermon notes forgotten on the lectern, while sunlight shifted across the pews like time itself had taken a breath. Outside, the faint hum of the SUVs faded down the road, leaving only the echo of that voice still ringing in everyone's ears. "Sergeant Clara Starr, report to Honor Guard Command." It sounded impossible, unreal, like hearing thunder on a clear day. The recruits who had mocked her now sat in uneasy silence, their jokes dissolving into guilt. Sergeant Hendricks leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the door as if he could will her back into the room. He'd seen faces like hers before, soldiers who had carried more than they could ever say. "That name," he whispered again, half to himself. "I read it once, after Ghazni." The others looked at him, confused. "Operation Dawnline," he continued, voice low. "That medic who stayed behind when the convoy was hit. She saved 6 men. Never spoke about it." Outside, the air had turned still. Down the road, Clara sat in the back of the SUV, hands clasped in her lap, eyes focused ahead. The young lieutenant driving glanced at her through the rearview mirror, but said nothing. He'd been briefed. Only one instruction: escort Sergeant Starr to Honor Guard Command. Treat her with full protocol. But even he couldn't help wondering. A woman not yet 30, dressed in civilian clothes, being called by rank most people earned through decades. It didn't add up. Yet the way she sat, straight-backed, composed, eyes steady, erased any doubt that it was a mistake. When the vehicle stopped outside the command building, officers were already lined up on the steps, uniforms pressed, caps in hand. Clara stepped out slowly, the faint sound of her boots clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks in a story no one had finished reading. A gust of wind caught the hem of her sweater, revealing a glimpse of a military dog tag tucked beneath. "Sergeant Starr," one of the officers said, his tone respectful, formal. "Thank you for coming. The general's waiting inside." She nodded once. Understood. The hallway smelled of waxed floors and old memories. Framed photos of honor ceremonies lined the walls, black and white faces of soldiers, some smiling, some solemn, all gone now. Clara paused briefly in front of one near the end of the corridor. A younger man in fatigues, bright-eyed, grin wide enough to light the frame. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Corporal Thomas Starling, Kia, 2016. Her brother. For the first time, her composure wavered. Just a flicker. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "Hey, Tommy," she whispered softly. They finally called. When she entered the conference room, a hush fell. General Harlow stood waiting beside the folded blue and gold banner that hung over the honor guard insignia. "Sergeant," he said quietly. "It's time." Clara nodded. "Who?" The general exhaled. "Captain Reynolds. Your old unit leader. His remains were identified this week. The ceremony's at 1400. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. Not grief, not surprise, just the slow, steady breath of someone who had carried silence too long. When she opened them again, her voice was clear. "Then let's bring him home right." Back at the chapel, word had already spread. The recruits who'd laughed that morning now sat in stunned remorse as Sergeant Hendricks told them the rest of the story. How she'd carried Reynolds out under fire, refused extraction until everyone else was lifted, how she'd been wounded but stayed conscious enough to stabilize her men until medevac arrived. The report had called her actions beyond protocol. She called it just doing my job. After the war, she left the service, took a civilian role on base, and came to that chapel every Sunday, to sit where her brother once prayed before deployment. When the afternoon sun began to set, the chapel bells rang for the honor guard procession. Those same recruits lined the walk, hats over hearts, as the convoy returned. And when the first car door opened, it wasn't a general who stepped out. It was Clara Starr, no sweater now, but the full dress blues of a combat medic, medals gleaming faintly in the dying light. The chaplain bowed his head. The recruits stood straighter. Even Sergeant Hendricks blinked hard, swallowing emotion he couldn't hide. She walked past them, calm as ever, carrying the folded flag for Captain Reynolds with both hands. No one spoke. No one dared. In that moment, the same woman they'd once called the girl who hums wasn't just Clara anymore. She was Sergeant Starr again, and every note she'd ever hummed now sounded like a promise finally kept. The ceremony began under a sky that looked painted, deep gold fading into gray, the kind of twilight that holds its breath. Rows of soldiers stood perfectly aligned on the field, the honor guard gleaming like a reflection of discipline itself. The flag fluttered against the wind, catching the last shards of light. At the front stood Clara Starr, shoulders back, expression steady, her silver medic insignia polished to a mirror shine. No one could see her hands trembling beneath the folded flag she carried. She didn't hide it. Trembling, after all, didn't mean fear. It meant weight. The chaplain read the invocation, voice wavering against the wind. The names of the fallen echoed through the speakers one by one. Men and women who had served with quiet conviction. And then came his name, Captain Daniel Reynolds. Clara closed her eyes briefly, remembering the laughter, the dust, the smell of burnt sand and adrenaline. The night he ordered her onto the helicopter, bleeding and furious, while he stayed behind to cover the retreat. The moment she realized his last words, "Tell them we held," were never about himself, but about all of them. As the bugler raised the trumpet, the air turned sharp. The first note of taps sliced cleanly through the silence, and the entire base seemed to hold still. Clara didn't blink. Her mind flickered through memories, the battlefield, the medevac lights, the hospital ceilings, the sterile quiet of recovery. And then, the years after, the quiet job, the forgotten Sundays, the chapel pews where she kept humming, not out of sadness, but so she wouldn't forget the sound of peace. When the last note faded, General Harlow approached her. He was older now, hair thin, eyes worn, but his salute was still crisp. "You've done your duty, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You could have walked away years ago." Clara met his gaze. "I did, sir," she said. "But some things keep calling until you answer." He nodded once, deeply. Then he extended his hand, not as a superior, but as a man honoring another. "You know," he murmured, "I read your file again this morning. The commendation you turned down. Why didn't you ever accept it?" Clara looked toward the casket draped in the flag, her voice barely above the wind. "Because medals don't belong to one person," she said. "They belong to moments. And the people who didn't make it back to wear them." The general didn't argue. He just bowed his head. When it was over, the formation broke slowly. Soldiers drifted back to barracks, officers to their cars. But the recruits from the chapel stayed. They didn't speak to her, didn't ask questions. They just stood at attention as she passed, silent apology written across every face. Clara stopped briefly beside them. "It's okay," she said softly. "You didn't know? Most people don't." Her tone wasn't sharp or proud. It was forgiving. "Just remember this. Not every uniform gets folded away when the war ends." She turned then, walking toward the chapel at the edge of the field. The door creaked open, the scent of candle wax and wood rushing to meet her. She went straight to the third pew, her pew, and sat, the same way she always did. But this time, there was no humming, only stillness. She reached for the locket beneath her collar, opening it to reveal two tiny photos, one of her brother and one of Captain Reynolds. Her thumb brushed the edge of both. Outside, the last of the sunset caught the stained glass, and for a fleeting moment, the light fell perfectly on her face. Calm, worn, resolute. The chaplain, standing by the door, watched quietly. He didn't speak, didn't move. He knew some prayers weren't meant to be said aloud. Later that night, when the chapel lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, a new plaque appeared on the west wall. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a simple inscription, brass polished smooth. Sergeant Clara Starr, Medic, 7th Division. Service beyond duty. Courage in silence. Beneath it, smaller words etched by hand, almost hidden. Some songs are meant to be heard only by God. The next morning, the pew she always sat in was empty again. But something had changed. The recruits who once whispered now sat quietly in her place, heads bowed, each humming softly under their breath, the same tune she used to hum alone. Outside, the wind carried it faintly across the base, a melody of remembrance, of peace, of the kind of strength that doesn't need applause. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, where duty ends and memory begins, you could almost hear it answer back.